Hello from the desert in Phoenix, Arizona, and welcome to this episode of Crossing Borders, where I interview entrepreneurs doing business across borders and the people who support them, with a focus on people with a connection to Latin America. My guest today is Marcus Dantus, founder of Startup Mexico and a partner at Dux Capital. Marcus and I talk about his tech startup career that dates all the way back to 1993 and how he ended up owning Mexico.com and many other top domains, how he started and ran other tech businesses during the 90s and 2000s. We cover how the Mexican startup ecosystem has changed, what he's doing with Startup Mexico to help empower Mexican entrepreneurs, and the types of companies he's interested in investing with his fund. We also look at the opportunities in the Mexican market. If you enjoy this podcast, you can find more of Marcus on this season's episode of Shark Tank Mexico. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Marcus Dantus. Hi, Marcus. Thanks for doing the podcast. Welcome.
On the contrary, Nathan, thank you for including me.
So where are you in the world today?
Mexico City.
And what are you doing in Mexico City?
Well, I'm managing Startup Mexico.
And can you tell me just a little bit about Startup Mexico?
Sure. Startup Mexico started as a campus for entrepreneurs in Mexico. We set out to build the biggest campus for entrepreneurship in Mexico in the midst of this entrepreneurial boom that we're seeing. And it has since evolved to a very large initiative that includes, not just the campus, but incubation programs, acceleration programs. We actually have an innovation school. We've noticed that there's a big lack of, innovation education in Mexico, even though we have a ton of potential for innovating. So basically, and now we've expanded to several cities in Mexico. We actually have 7 campuses. So I would tell you in a nutshell that we are the largest Mexican initiative for entrepreneurship in Latin America. No?
Awesome. So I'm going to dig more into Startup Mexico in a little bit, but I want to jump back to your experience in the Mexican ecosystem. You're one of the more experienced entrepreneurs and investors in the tech sector in Mexico, and wanted to jump back to where it all got started. So can you tell me how you first got started with tech and entrepreneurship?
Well, this is an interesting story. I actually studied cinema. I studied communications in mass media and codes in the University of Pennsylvania. I wanted to become a movie director. Wow. When I came back to Mexico, this is in '89. When I came back to Mexico, I tried to work in movies and advertising for a long time. And the problem that I found is that the movies made in Mexico were awful, and there wasn't really a good industry for it at that time. And one of my friends showed me the internet, and I thought it was an incredible medium. And I started playing with it. I created my own website. And, my website was actually hosted in CompuServe. In those days, first of all, there were 14.4 modems, so it was really slow. And the second thing was that this is, by the way, 93. So I created my own website, and, I put one of those counters in it. And to my surprise, even though the address to the website was something like ourworld.compuserve.com/users/free pages/ a number, I got a lot of visitors. Probably, a big chunk of the visitors was myself looking at the counter. But at the same time, I was getting a lot of visitors from out of Mexico and from different parts, not just in Mexico, but outside of Mexico in the world. So I decided to use a domain I recently discovered that there were domains on the internet. And I, set out to look for a domain, and I started looking for a domain that meant speed because the modems were really slow, and something Mexican, and I came out with speedygonzalez.com. For some reason, Warner Brothers did not register it properly. So I registered, and then I got a cease or desist letter from Warner Brothers immediately. And I gave them the domain, and all my friends were like, man, you blew it. These guys could have paid you a lot of money for it, etc. So I registered andale.com, which, was almost the same, but was more generic. And I got a letter a couple of weeks after that from a company telling me that they were interested in acquiring the domain Andale. And I thought it was a joke. So they were offering $10,000. And I said, well, I'll sell it to you for $20,000, still thinking it was a joke. And they deposited $20,000 on my account. And I was like, man, this is the best business in the world. So I started registering a bunch of domains. I ended up registering 800 generic domains in Spanish and trading domains. And my website eventually became mexico.com because that's one of the domains I acquired. And long story short, in 2000, we got funded, around $8 million for like 30% of the business, which was completely surprising to me. But this is where I discovered the venture capital industry, and that's how I began.
And was that 8 million from investors in Mexico or in the US?
No, they were investors in the US.
And were you living in the US at the time, or had you moved back to Mexico?
Well, I was about to move to Los Angeles because that's actually where we got our investment. I didn't even know Silicon Valley existed. And we did our venture capital tour in Miami, New York, and Los Angeles. And we got a bunch of investors from Los Angeles, but this was about 3 weeks before NASDAQ plummeted and the bubble burst. So that was a short-lived moment.
And what did Mexico.com do back then?
Well, it was a portal of portals. It was the first Mexican internet portal. And the idea was that you could get your email on, at mexico.com. My email used to be president@mexico.com. And
that's a great email.
Yeah, I know. And but we had so many domains that inside mexico.com, to give you an example, we had soccer.com. So people that were interested in soccer, they could have their domains at soccer.com, or they could have the domains at tequila.com or at a specific town in Mexico like cuernavaca.com, etc. So it was an interesting idea. Once we got the investment, my partner decided, he was named CEO, although he really didn't participate in the beginning. And then he decided to make Mexico.com a portal, a media portal. And everybody agreed with the strategy. So I left the company. And, with NASDAQ plummeting and people not interested in a media portal, the company eventually died. No?
And so what did you do after Mexico.com?
So when the demise of Mexico.com was happening, there was a magazine, I don't know if you remember, but it was called Red Herring. Mm-hmm. Used to be like The Wired back then. And they did an amazing article on us. And in their article, I came out as, a guy that is very truthful. My investors didn't enjoy really my openness. But I got a lot of people contacting me, and I got offers to become the CEO of a couple of internet companies that were out there, etc. But I got an offer from a Swiss guy who was a telecom expert, and he wanted to bring voice recognition to Mexico. This is in 2000. So at the end of 2000, so we partnered and we started a second business called Simitel. which was actually another interesting success.
And so tell me a little bit more about how that business went down and developed.
So Simitel, we started doing a lot of telecommunication stuff. So we had our own IVR and our own ACD, which is an automated call distributor, and our own recording, and everything was done via software. So we basically started inventing our own software for call centers. It eventually, our group of our tech group eventually discovered a way to route Skype calls. And we ended up spinning off a company called Pirant in 2005 that we took to Silicon Valley. And this company was a few days from being acquired by Skype, because we actually got to meet Howard Gartenbaum, who was one of the main investors in Skype initially. And he introduced us to the people from Skype, and we were talking to Skype, and all of a sudden eBay acquired Skype. And then we were left out, and we ended up selling this company to a British group. Simitel continued for a couple more years, and then we decided to close it down because voice recognition was slow.
Were you based in Mexico when that was happening, or still US?
No. I was based in Mexico, and I lived in around Palo Alto for about a year.
So what was it like in the early 2000s doing tech businesses across borders from Mexico?
It was, nobody even understood it. Nobody even understood entrepreneurship in Mexico in those days. Not even my parents. When they asked me, what are you doing? And I said, I'm an entrepreneur. They would tell me, why don't you get a real job, So it was an interesting times.
So were the Mexican either business community or your friends and family more skeptical, or were Silicon Valley investors more skeptical about doing business in Mexico? Who was more, or both?
I think both. I think, at those times, even now, Mexico is not really a place that you would consider as a, highly innovative place. So that was a big problem. But also in Mexico, they didn't understand entrepreneurship at all. So it was very interesting.
So how did it feel back in the early 2000s, or even before that in the late 90s, before the bubble, to be working on a sector that most of the people that you met in your day-to-day were either just didn't understand or sort of looked down on? What was that like?
Well, it was frustrating in a way, but in another way, I thought it was a great opportunity, and this is why I enjoyed it.
And so after doing that and doing some cross-border stuff between Mexico and the Valley, what was next for you?
So, after that, I was when we closed down Simitel, I was actually called by a friend of mine who had a medical device development company, and I became the CEO of the company. And we turned it into a sort of incubator for medical devices. And that company actually spun off another company in Silicon Valley as well. And, that went really well. We ended up selling it to a fund in Mexico. And after that, I was, to be honest with you, a little bit tired of being an entrepreneur. So I decided to kind of retire for a little while. And I started teaching in Mexican University entrepreneurship. And I created the entrepreneurial center for that university. And then in the midst of doing that, I got a call from Telefonica asking me if I wanted to open Wayra, which was Telefonica's accelerator for IT. And I said yes, and that's that. So I became the founder of Wayra Mexico, and started incubating startups then.
And what was Wayra like back then in that would have been 2010, 2011? What countries was Wayra in, and where did Mexico fit into the expansion plans?
So Wayra was initially in Colombia and Spain and Mexico. That was the beginning of Wayra. And then it broadened to other Latin American countries. The original idea for Wayra was actually to create Latin American startups, and then it broadened actually to some European countries as well.
So you ended up crossing from being a tech entrepreneur, then going into medical devices, which is pretty different from doing web stuff, and then moving to the other side of the table on the investment side with Wayra. So you've done 3 or maybe even more big changes over, say, a 10 or 15 year period. What was it like making that change from the entrepreneur side to the investor side?
Well, with Wayra, it wasn't really an investor side, although it did have a little bit of we did invest in some companies as Wayra, but I felt more like it was a lot more about incubation than investment. The investment decisions, were basically sort of like a Y Combinator model in the sense that you invest very little in companies initially, but I don't think I would call it crossing the side to the investor side just yet. No, I mean that happened later. And regarding medical devices, let me tell you, my opinion is that even though it's a completely different industry, and I agree with you there, the funny thing is that at the end of the day, it's still entrepreneurship, and no matter what you sell or what service or product you do, it's pretty similar.
Do you find that in the entrepreneurs that you've accelerated with Wayra and now have invested in or met with Startup Mexico and some of the funds and accelerators you've worked with, that holds true for most businesses, where it's the same sort of skill set that is required to get a business off the ground, or do you see lots of differences?
No, I would honestly feel that it's very similar. No matter what industry you are, there are a lot of similarities between industries. At the end of the day, it's about working hard and executing properly, and of course, understanding what it is that you're selling. But the execution is pretty similar, I would think.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's pretty similar to what we see in our early stage investments too. It's most of the startups are battling almost the same problems.
Right.
So when you were at Wayra and you're accelerating or incubating some of these companies, what would be the 1 or 2 things that you wished you knew at the beginning after you'd accelerated a couple classes of startups?
Well, actually, what happened to me with Wayra is that I thought that the model was not the proper model for Mexico, for example. And I'll tell you why. Because I thought that the biggest problem is that you need to learn a lot more about the entrepreneur before making an investment. With Wayra, as with many other incubators and accelerators, you give money to them before you even know them, and that kind of spoils them in the beginning. And that's what we were trying to avoid with Startup Mexico, based on our experience with Wayra. Does that make sense?
Got it. Yeah, it makes sense. So how did you take those lessons and go forward to implement something different?
So, well, I mean, the other thing I didn't really enjoy about Telefonica was actually that Telefonica is a very large corporation, very bureaucratic. And, in order to buy a laptop, it took you like 4 months. And if you're incubating startups or accelerating startups in the midst of this bureaucracy, it's almost impossible. So so that's one of the reasons why I also wanted to leave Telefonica. So based on these learnings, if you will, I decided to do something a lot bigger and a lot more inclusive and a lot faster. And this is how Startup Mexico came to be. So the first thing I did is I went to an event. When I just left Wayra, there was an event. It's called the Entrepreneurship Week in Mexico, and it's an event done by the Ministry of Economy. And I met with the head of the National Institute of Entrepreneurship back then, and I told him, "Look, I'm free of Wayra. Would you be interested in doing something, a lot more relevant?" And that's all I said. And it was really funny because a couple of weeks after, I got a call from his secretary saying that he really loved my proposal and that he would love for me to present it officially and to do it. And I didn't remember what I proposed to the guy. So it was really funny. So then I came up with this idea of transforming a huge warehouse, 40,000 square foot warehouse, into like a Disneyland for entrepreneurs in the midst of Mexico City. So that's what I presented. He loved the idea. We got some initial grant money from them. I invested a little bit of money myself, and Startup Mexico was born.
And so Startup Mexico today has that facility, which with the Disneyland for entrepreneurs. And then you also said it's in a few other cities. What other cities are you in now?
So the second city we opened up was Merida, which is in the Yucatan Peninsula. Third city we opened was León, which is smack in the middle of Mexico. And it's a city that's very industrial and has a lot of automotive industry, among other things. Fourth city we opened was Querétaro. Fifth city was Nuevo Laredo in the border. Sixth city was Oaxaca, which is one of the poorest cities in Mexico. A lot of tradition, a lot of folklore. And we are now opening Guadalajara, which is Mexico's second largest city and probably the most well-known city for IT.
That's a fast expansion for lots of different cities. Is it the same idea in each city with a physical space and the same sort of services?
It's the same idea, but it's not as big as in Mexico City. Because these are smaller cities that I don't think require that much space.
And so how many people are in the Mexico City space now between employees, entrepreneurs, universities, everyone who's kind of in there? How many people go there each day or week?
So typically we have between 150 and 200 people here. But when we have events, we've had up to 2,000 people.
Wow, that's a lot of people. And so what's kind of the most interesting thing or most exciting thing that's happening in Startup Mexico today?
Well, there's several things. We are growing our model, horizontally, in the sense that we're offering more services for startups. So we started initially with just an incubation model where we would select startups and then not charge them and not get equity from them, but get government grants, because the government was very interested in, developing entrepreneurship in Mexico. So we started with that model. And as we're trying to become more independent from the government, we now have models that have to do with accelerating startups that already exist, not just creating them, and some educational stuff, like we have an academy that teaches entrepreneurship and teaches how to invest in startups and has innovation classes. So we're expanding. We also have the fund, which is now investing in startups, because from around 300 startups that we created in the first 3 years, 57 of them got funded, which in Mexico is a big number. And we weren't participating in any of them. because I didn't think it was ethical for us to keep shares in companies where we're not using our money to incubate. So now we have the fund that actually invests in some of these startups early stage. And basically, that's it. I mean, we are exploring more services that we're providing entrepreneurs, etc.
And what's the fund called, and how much does it invest, and what's kind of the process if someone wants to get investment from you?
So the fund is called Dux Capital. It's a fund that invests initially between $50,000 and $200,000 on an early stage company, which, by the way, that's what we call seed in Mexico. And then we reserve about 40% of the fund for follow-on investments in those companies. The process is very simple. We either take companies that are being incubated in the later stages of incubation of Startup Mexico, or companies can contact us directly. And, we analyze their model. We tell them if we're interested. Then we pass them through two committees. In Mexico, it has to be like this. The first committee decides if we can go and proceed with the due diligence process. And the second committee is after the due diligence to decide on the investment.
And so what kind of areas or sectors are you looking at in the fund? Or is it more opportunistic?
So we look at three sectors. We look at energy, we look at retail, and we look at technology innovation. And I know that's very broad, but that is a very broad category that we're looking at.
So the second two sound fairly traditional for a lot of funds in Latin America or even the US, but energy isn't generally in a lot of portfolios for early stage. So can you talk a little bit about why you chose energy as a focus and why that's an opportunity for Mexico?
Well, by energy, we are referring more to clean energy and to anything that has to be, has to do with ecology in general. And it's an opportunity in Mexico because we are incredibly polluted, and because we feel that it's something we need to push. So we are looking at companies like that. It's not just clean energy; it's also cleaning up the environment. It has to do with, for example, converting trash into products or trash into fuel. Or we recently, the first company we invested in is a company that transforms the plastic bottles into paper that you can write on. So those kinds of processes.
So you talked about cleaning up the environment in Mexico and also for other places in Latin America as being an opportunity. What are some of the other opportunities that you see for Mexico and Latin America for generally thinking about people that maybe either haven't been to Mexico or only have been for a vacation and don't necessarily know the realities on the ground for the vast majority of people?
So there's several opportunities that I like. First of all, we live in countries where banking the unbanked is a huge opportunity. So anything that has to do with fintech, I think it's huge, especially anything that has to do with blockchain. You have to understand that, and I'm not talking just about cryptocurrencies. Actually, that's the least of the opportunities in blockchain that I'm interested in. I'm talking about the possibility of, not relying on a centralized authority or something. In Mexico, we don't trust in Latin America in general. I don't think we trust institutions. So if we can learn through blockchain to start trusting each other, I think it's a very important opportunity. A second large opportunity that I see, of course, is anything that has to do with remittances, for example. which I also think that blockchain can help a lot with. I think that in Mexico, there's very few things that have been automated. So anything that has to do with robotics, automation, artificial intelligence, I think are huge opportunity. And also, there's so much data in Mexico that has not been used properly, that big data and IoT are great opportunities right now. Another area is, for example, mobile phones and apps. And the reason is because Mexico, in difference to the US, for example, a vast majority of Mexicans, the first time they access the internet is through their mobile phone. So that also presents great opportunities to basically create apps that continue to educate people and reduce the digital gap between people that have internet on their computers and people that don't. I already mentioned clean tech and pollution. Populations are growing really fast in Latin America. Streets are saturated. Traffic is always a big opportunity. And finally, I would say social impact. There's a big social inequity in Mexico. There's a very bad wealth, in Latin America in general, bad wealth distribution. Even though wealth is being created, it's not being distributed. So I think that's a very large opportunity as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good overview. I think the fintech and blockchain pieces are really potentially eye-opening for people that aren't in the region, because even some of our mentors in Magma that have talked with some of our Latin American founders, and maybe they've been to the region a few times, their minds are blown when you tell them you just can't go and open a bank account if you want to, even if you have money sometimes. Where 80% of people don't have a bank account yet, where in not so much in countries like Mexico or Chile as much, but there's areas where property transfer just doesn't work. It takes months, or maybe there's not a good record of it. And I think a lot of the naysayers of blockchain, especially in the US and Europe, are completely missing the use cases of it in less developed markets. I think it's really interesting that you have that as on your list.
Talking about blockchain, I mean, think about, for example, digital rights management. There's so many artists that are being screwed by either musicians or movie artists or painters. People that write for newspapers. I mean, all those people could make a ton of money with this as well. And there's another huge area. Remember, sharing economies, which is something that we really need without necessarily having an intermediate. And the final thing I would say about blockchain is maybe democracy. We are in countries that always had a problem with democracy and frauds in elections and whatnot. And blockchain can easily solve that.
Yeah, it's definitely a really interesting opportunity for Latin America. And I would argue that it's actually probably more interesting in developing markets like Latin America than necessarily in the US, where stuff more or less works in the financial sector and more or less works in most industries comparatively, where the use case is a lot more.
And I would completely agree with you.
So going back to some of the companies that you've seen either go through Startup Mexico or that you've invested in with the fund, what are some of the most interesting ones that you think are solving some of those big problems that you talked about?
Well, look, you have to understand, and this is kind of a disclaimer, but it's kind of early for this. The Mexican ecosystem is about 5 years old, like truly, or maybe 6. So the companies that started, say, 2 or 3 years ago, they're really young and they're very new. But there are some companies, the main companies in blockchain, for example, are right now creating cryptocurrencies and doing ICOs, which I think is not the correct way to take advantage of this. But there are some companies that are doing Internet of Things that are interesting. For example, I'll give you an example. There's a company called Urband that is that has an open platform for a wristband that you can use to, create about, like, for example, you can change the music or take a selfie from afar or stuff like that. But the interesting part is that they have an open platform where anybody can create the basically the any application through their API, and it can be added to the wristband. There's another company that does crowdfunding in Mexico called Play Business that I think is growing really fast. There's a company called Fairbank that's recently launching that has to do with a digital wallet and digital contracts, and hopefully remittances as well. There's a bunch of companies in fintech in the area of microloans. And everybody says that those are going to be the next unicorns in Mexico. I'm not so sure. I don't think, to be honest with you, I don't think we've identified the next Mexican unicorn yet. It's certainly out there.
What do you think on there has been a lot of hype on microloans and mobile device loans in Mexico and in Brazil and other parts of Latin America. Why do you think that it may not live up to the potential that some people think so far?
Well, first of all, these companies list themselves as a kind of social impact companies, and the rates they charge are ridiculously high, in my opinion. So that's, in my opinion, the first problem. But the second problem is that the way they measure their how do you call it when somebody doesn't pay a loan?
The default
rate is incorrect. So let me give you an example. A company, one of these companies has a default rate of, say, 40%. Then gets 10 times the investment that they got originally. So obviously the default rate goes to 4%. And then they claim they have 4%. And then they keep loaning until they get to 40%. And then they raise again, a big chunk of money and claim again that they're at 4%. So to me, this is kind of a house of cards, that's going to be eventually, it's almost like a Ponzi scheme. But there are companies that are doing this correctly. Let me give you a couple of examples. And actually, to offset the default rate, they increase the interest rates on the loans. So there's a company in Mexico, I'm not going to mention their name, but there's a company in Mexico that charges, I believe it's around 2,000% interest a year on their loans, which is ridiculous, man. And they call themselves a social impact company. And to me, that has nothing to do with social impact. There are companies like, there's a small company called Lend.Me, for example, just beginning. So there's still a long way to go for them. But they actually do loans based on payroll. And by doing that, they can lower the default rate. And by doing that, they can lower the interest rates. So I think that, for example, that's an interesting model if they can pull it off. So, there are some good things that are happening. I've yet to be sure about how these companies are going to end up eventually, no?
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, the default rates are really, really important. We saw that with some of the peer-to-peer lending companies that we've reviewed over the few years. And yeah, it's hard to figure out who's going to default, who's not, and actually do the collection. So I agree that's a big hurdle that these companies need to get over.
Right.
So going back to your comment about the ecosystem potentially being only 5 or 6 years old, what are the top things that you think need to happen to improve the ecosystem and really take it to that next level? Or better yet, like what's that inflection point that the ecosystem needs to really start moving fast?
Well, believe it or not, I think those are two different questions. So let me answer them separately. The ecosystem in Mexico has a lot of talent. You know, the enrollment in universities in Mexico has tripled in the last 15 years. We have a demographic bonus, whereas half of the population is under 30 years old. Actually, the median is 27. There's a lot of funds being created. We went from 3 venture capital and seed funds in 2008 to over 60 by 2015. There's a good opinion on Mexico in international markets. Actually, there's a great phrase by an author called Andres Oppenheimer from the Miami Herald that is that the whole world is bullish on Mexico except Mexicans. So those are the good things. The bad things is that we are still a society that's very adverse to risk. We are a society that doesn't tolerate failure. We don't have that many financial exits. So the stock market in Mexico, it doesn't, not a lot of companies reach the stock market. And there's not a lot of mergers and acquisitions regarding startups. So that, of course, continues to affect investment and inhibits investment. And then on top of this, more as a systemic problem, there's a lot of corruption. But we don't trust institutions. This is where I think, things like blockchain can make a big difference. And this is an electorate year for many countries. There were just elections in Costa Rica. Colombia just had the first round of elections. Mexico's having elections. Brazil, Venezuela. So if Latin America starts going left, as it seems to be happening, and becoming very populist, leftist, then many of these things might actually slow down or disappear completely. I'm talking about the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Now, regarding your second question, what is the tipping point? I think the tipping point has to be success stories. If you look at the US or Europe or Japan or China, the heroes now are the entrepreneurs that have made it. In the US, an Elon Musk or a Jeff Bezos or a Zuckerberg or Larry Page and Sergey Brin. I mean, you name it. In Europe, you have Richard Branson, for example, or Janus Friis from Skype, or Niklas Wenström. In Asia, you have Masayoshi Son in Japan, or from SoftBank, or the guy from Alibaba, Jack Ma. In Mexico, we don't have those heroes yet. There's only 2 countries in Latin America that have had sporadically successful exits, and those are Argentina and Brazil. So this needs to start happening more frequently and in more countries in order for this to really detonate, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think you're spot on with that. There just needs to be more success stories. And the other thing that I think is really interesting, and I've been trying to think about how to work at it from the other end, is that in the US, for better or for worse, just the fact that somebody made money, doesn't even matter if they made it winning the lottery, is something that in the US is sort of celebrated. Like, hey, you've arrived, you have some money. The US, I think, takes it too far. But in many places in Latin America, it's like, the tallest sunflowers gets its head chopped off, where whoever is successful, there isn't that celebration of success, even like moderate successes from somebody building a nice size small business and saying, wow, this guy is the example to follow.
On some ways, it's the opposite, Nathan. I mean, I've always said that we are a country that doesn't tolerate failure, but punishes success. Mm-hmm. And so we are a society that tends to mediocrity. Think about it. If you are very successful in Latin America, specifically in Mexico, but I think I can talk to you about most of Latin America, people start saying that you cheated. society starts talking bad about you. There's envies and whatnot. You might even get kidnapped. So we are a place where success is also dangerous. So yeah, that has to change. That has to change with society.
So talking about things that could change, you've been in the ecosystem now, both as an entrepreneur, an incubator, and also now as an investor and someone supporting the ecosystem for now, I guess since 1993. It's a long time. What would you, if you could give yourself advice going back to your 1993 self, knowing what you know today about startups and the ecosystem, what advice would you give yourself?
Oh man, the advice I would give myself is awful, but it's not doing in Mexico. I would have gone much faster, And it's awful to say that. And I think that now that has been corrected, or it's in the process of being corrected. But if I would have done this 20 years ago, 25 years ago, anywhere in the US, especially in places like Silicon Valley, I would have made it much faster and much bigger. Mexico was, and still is in some ways, and Latin America in general, is still a hostile place for entrepreneurship. It's improving, and it's improving fast, but there's still a long way to go.
And how about that same question, but based on your experience in Startup Mexico? So if you could go back to when you were starting Startup Mexico, knowing what you know today, what advice would you give yourself?
I think I would have changed the model a little bit. I think I would have depended initially much less on government funds and find a way to monetize everything we do. We started out as a social enterprise where we didn't take equity from startups, we didn't charge entrepreneurs, and that made a hole in our finances for a little while. So we're starting to change the model. I think we could have noticed that a little bit better initially.
And do you have any blogs, podcasts, documentaries, books, or any sort of media that you would recommend to either an entrepreneur or even just anyone getting started in their business career today that you like to recommend?
There's many things that I would recommend. I would recommend that people read things like Crossing the Chasm, which is an old book, but it's a really good book about how to take technology from the early adopters and innovators to the rest of the public, if you will. I love the book The Tipping Point, which is something you were talking about, but it kind of focuses on the same. But I really like that book. I love the book by actually the thing that gave me the idea to create Startup Mexico was a book by Bill Draper called The Startup Game, in which he describes the ambience of Silicon Valley in the late 60s, early 70s, and how it became what it became. So there's a ton of books I could recommend.
And so with the ecosystem developing, with Startup Mexico developing, and some of the first potential success stories starting to develop, how does it feel to see that development going all the way back and looking back on when it was a time where people almost looked down on you or made fun of you for being an entrepreneur? How does it feel to see that ecosystem starting to build?
I mean, it's great, man. The time to become an entrepreneur in Mexico is now, without a doubt. And I think in Latin America in general, I think that places like Colombia or Peru are a little bit behind Mexico, but they're coming up very strong. Brazil is a great place. Argentina is recovering its economy. Chile is ahead of everybody except they have a very small market. But I think it's a great time to become an entrepreneur. It's almost a fad to become an entrepreneur amongst millennials. So I hope that it continues and it continues to grow stronger, regardless of who wins the elections in these countries. And I think, look, I'll tell you another thing. I think this is I think this is important that people actually understand how important entrepreneurship is for emerging markets. Entrepreneurship creates opportunities, it creates jobs, it creates competitivity, but it creates jobs that are actually highly paid. So that distributes wealth better, which in turn should lower crime. I mean, there's so many of the problems that we have as societies in Latin America that could be solved with entrepreneurship and innovation. And this is why we try to foster it carefully.
Yeah, I'm with you. I really think that startups, entrepreneurship, and just the technology and knowledge transfer that happens when you have new businesses, hiring lots of people, training them on new technology and on new ways of thinking is the most powerful way to bend the arc of a country or even an entire region. And that's one of the things that I'm most interested in with Magma. And it's really fun to talk to other people who are who share that vision and are working to do it across the region. So,
well, and I'll tell you something else. It's a model that's been proven, Nathan. It's been proven in places like Singapore and Malaysia and Chile and Israel and Ireland. I mean, and South Korea. It's proven everywhere. I don't know why we just don't follow them.
Well, I think that we will, and I think we do need those first success stories where it just becomes so obvious that it's going to happen in Latin America as well. And I'm pretty bullish on the next, say, 3 to 5 years that we will have some of these. So I hope we get to connect more in the future and share the experiences going forward. And really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation with me. I think it's a really interesting view into the Mexican market.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me again. And I hope we have the opportunity to talk as well in a couple of years and see how this developed.
Definitely. We definitely will. Thanks again, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Nathan. Bye-bye.
Thanks again for listening to this episode of Crossing Borders with Startup Mexico and Dux Capital founder Marcus Dantus. If you enjoyed it, please share it with a friend, as that's the best way to share the message and let people know what's going on in Latin America. And we would also really appreciate it if you leave us a review on iTunes and Stitcher. Thanks again for listening, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day. Special thanks to Anko and Sophia from our team who are making this podcast happen.